Hello and welcome to today's Center for Healthcare Strategies webinar on the use and financing of non-pharmacologic evidence-based practices, alternatives to psychotropic medications, part of the Psychotropic Medications Virtual Learning Community webinar series. To eliminate background noise, phone lines are being muted during today's presentation. There will be 3 question and answer sessions held during today's event, and instructions for participation are shown on the screen at this time. If you experience technical difficulties today, you may dial 1-866-229-3239 for assistance, or click the question mark icon located in the floating toolbar at the top of your computer screen. Today's event will be recorded. At the completion of the webinar, we ask that you complete a very brief online evaluation that will pop up on your screen. Your feedback is very important to us, and we hope that you are able to complete the survey. I will now turn the webinar over to Kamala Allen, Director of Child Health Quality at the Center for Healthcare Strategies.
Thank you, Travis. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for today's Technical Assistance webinar. This is the 3rd in a series of technical assistance sessions funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and SAMHSA under a cooperative agreement with the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. So we're very happy to have you with us today. The first webinar in our series focused on agency consent. The second on metrics developed by our 6-state data subgroup that was focused on ways to ensure consistency in the collection and reporting of information related to use of psychotropic medications among children in foster care. Today's session is focused on the use of 2 particular evidence-based practices. We believe that in order to provide the most appropriate care to children, state agencies and providers must have a range of effective options that they can choose from based on the unique needs of each child. Just a reminder to everyone regarding the context here. So we mentioned on previous webinars that we had recently completed a national analysis of Medicaid's claim data. And within that, we conducted some special analyses related to the foster care population with regard to their behavioral health service use and with regard to the use of psychotropic medications. And what we found in that data is that children in foster care were more likely to be prescribed psychotropic medications at a rate of 27% for children in foster care versus 23% for children with SSI and disability eligibility and 4% of children with TANF eligibility. They were also more likely to receive multiple psychotropic medications, with 40% receiving 2 or more psychotropic meds, some of which may be totally appropriate, and 20% who received 3 or more psychotropic medications. They were also highly likely to be prescribed antipsychotics, as likely as children with SSI and disability eligibility versus 18%, and that was at a rate of 42%, versus 18% of children with TANF eligibility. So there's a significant opportunity here to improve the quality and outcomes of care for children in foster care as it relates to use of psychotropic medications. Next slide, please. So states are taking a number of approaches to trying to address this population specifically and in many contexts for their broader Medicaid population of children, because the use of psychotropic medication in children in Medicaid is high as well. However, with specific interest in children in foster care, states are pursuing collaborations among Medicaid, child welfare, and behavioral health agencies. There are several multi-state national efforts underway, as well as some single-state efforts to address this issue, bringing together public and private partnerships. States are also thinking about how to better oversee and monitor the use of psychotropic medications among a range of complex and high-cost services that are being provided to this population. If you were not able to participate in our first webinar session, that information is online and available to you. 2 other approaches, specialized care management approaches or care management entities being one of those. We also have information on our CHS website as part of a 3-state collaborative, the states of Maryland, Georgia, and Wyoming, focused on implementing and or expanding and refining the care management entity models in their states. Also, managed care carve-outs, especially carve-outs for the foster care population or for behavioral health services that are designed to better address the unique needs of this population, and specialty provider networks. So providers who have signed on or been assigned to better manage care for this population to ensure early access, better screening and assessment, and better referrals to specialists when appropriate. And then finally, as a segue into the content for our session today, access to evidence-based and non-pharmacologic interventions. So today's session is going to focus on wraparound and what we lovingly call map and wrap, two evidence-based approaches that can be used to better address the needs of children in foster care, providing an alternative to psychotropic medications when appropriate. So with that being said, I don't want to take any more time. I'm going to turn it over to this point to my colleague Sheila Pyries, who's going to provide a little bit more context for today and introduce our featured speakers. Sheila?
Thanks a lot, Kamala, and good morning, everyone. So we have listening in not only the states participating in the Center's Quality Collaborative on improving the use of psychotropic medications for children in foster care and our broader learning community interested in that topic. We also have the states participating in the Center's Care Management Entity Quality Collaborative and that broader learning community of states. And both groups of states have identified the need to implement more effective, evidence-informed alternatives, not only to the use of psychotropic medications where appropriate, but also to more traditionally based services around which there has not been a great deal of evidence, such as residential treatment and other out-of-home care. And states are also interested in approaches that are not only effective but are efficient. Resources are tight. There are a lot of demand for resources. States have struggled with trying to bring to scale manualized evidence-based programs, although we also benefit in the children's arena from a growing number of evidence-based programs, both those listed on the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration's National Registry of Effective Practices and other places such as the California Clearinghouse on Evidence-Based Practices in Child Welfare. But I think states are interested in how you can integrate effective practice into what I would call regular care. At the same time, we have an increasing number of states and communities that are implementing fidelity wraparound approaches that are an evidence-informed approach to the planning of services and support. So how do you make sure that the child and family teams have access to effective services to populate plans of care? And so our two presenters today, and we're very happy to have them both, are going to describe their work to date to kind of bring together or align fidelity wraparound with managing and adapting practice, or MAP, which is a system for integrating evidence-based decision and practice support tools into clinical practice. So our two speakers include Dr. Eric Bruns, who's a clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And Eric is nationally known for his research and development work on the wraparound process, school mental health services, and statewide children's behavioral health systems. And with Eric Trupin, he co-directs the Washington State Children's Mental Health Evidence-Based Practice Institute. Our second speaker is Dr. Bruce Torpeda, who is professor of psychology at UCLA and president of PracticeWise. He is was formerly the clinical director of the Hawaii Department of Health's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. His work is aimed at improving the effectiveness of mental health service systems for children through innovation in treatment design, clinical decision-making, and information delivery models and system architecture. And his recent work has focused on designing treatments that can adapt in real time to local contexts and to emergent youth and family needs while staying grounded in scientifically tested procedures. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Eric, and thank you both again for presenting.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sheila and Kamala. And in addition to the descriptions that Sheila provided about myself and Bruce, you also know now that we have worked together long enough to go chatting offline, seemingly about our fantasy football team. So sorry for sending out that public chat. I really appreciate Kamala's introduction to the topic and Sheila's as well, because oftentimes webinars focus on canned programs, manualized evidence-based practice models when we're talking about improving care delivered to children and families. What we're going to talk about today, we do in fact lovingly refer to variously as WRAP plus MAP, or sometimes MAP-around. But what we're really talking about here is not something that represents some sort of canned practice model or something that has actually even been experimentally tested as a package. What it really is something that represents the interests of both Bruce and myself, which is how to thoughtfully engineer service systems that can be evidence-based as systems, not necessarily being composed of multiple evidence-based practices, although that can be a very effective way to try to meet the needs of kids and families in a system. What we're really talking about is the need, given the complexity of child-serving systems and the complexity of the needs of youth who have system involvement, particularly when they're involved in multiple systems. You know, our feeling is that it's really paramount that we as a field of service delivery agents and researchers and others are thinking about how to thoughtfully engineer systems that are equipped to provide multiple functions and services and approaches that can work together in coordinated fashion to provide effective and individualized responses to the needs of children and families. So two of the paradigms or service approaches that have traditionally been seen as being very important for service systems, wraparound as well as evidence-based treatments or research-based practices, have also been somewhat difficult to provide in coordinated fashion in systems. This is something that both researchers have kind of uncovered, but primarily it's been through the experiences of states trying to achieve this. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to one potential method or a range of potential methods to coordinate evidence-based practices with care coordination using wraparound as well as the MAP system. So first off, we want to thank several folks, the Institute for Innovation and Implementation at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, Catholic Community Services of Western Washington. There are a couple of the settings in which we have been talking about doing this kind of coordinated work and begun to pilot some work blending, so to speak, wraparound with MAP. Also want to just direct attendees to the website of the National Wraparound Initiative, www.nwi.pdx.edu. Here you're going to find all sorts of resources about wraparound, including strategies for implementing it with the greatest potential for positive effects. And so we encourage you to visit the site. So what we're going to do to try and discuss this idea of using wraparound as well as managing and adapting practice system to create a more evidence-based system for these kids with complex needs, we're just going to give a little bit of background on wraparound and why we may need to pay more attention to the effectiveness of clinical services when we are in fact using a wraparound-based, working within a wraparound-based system that has wraparound care coordination as one of the features. Bruce is then going to come on and give an overview of MAP, the Managing and Adapting Practice System, and we will stop along the way to provide some initial ideas about ways in which MAP and wraparound might be coordinated and the kinds of outcomes that we're attempting to achieve by doing so in some of our pilot sites. Again, places like Maryland, Western Washington, and a couple of other states, as well as several sites in California that have kind of organically begun to coordinate both wraparound and the MAP system. We'll give you some of our lessons learned thus far. So just here's a little bit of background for those who have not delved deeply into the wraparound research base. This is not a service. Wraparound is a care coordination process that is increasingly being used statewide in multiple states and also large jurisdictions to try to help coordinate, bring together in a thoughtful and individualized manner plans of care and then implement those plans of care for kids with multiple system involvement. The research base for wraparound now features 10 published controlled studies across all sorts of different kinds of primary service systems that were using the wraparound care coordination method, most notably child welfare, mental health, and juvenile justice. And you can see the summary here of these 10 studies, and you can go to the National Wraparound Initiative website to get more detail about each of them, as well as a synthesis of all of the findings. To give you the real quick synthesis of the findings, these are effect sizes across the typical outcome domains that wraparound is looking to impact for children and families. The most common outcome that wraparound is attempting to target is the living situation of the young people, trying to keep them at home and in community. Other studies have also targeted mental health outcomes, usually measured by standardized measures such as the CANS or the CAFAS, school functioning, community functioning, which includes juvenile justice recidivism. What you can see is that wraparound, depending on which kind of method you use in your meta-analytic techniques, has got a significant effect across all of these domains. But what we see is that it achieves the biggest domains in the living situation area, whereas mental health, school, and community functioning is somewhat smaller effect sizes. What we kind of extending that discussion about where wraparound seems to have the largest effects, what we really do see is that these residential and cost outcomes are the most commonly found and robust outcomes of wraparound. So we've seen real early pioneers like Wraparound Milwaukee taking their psychiatric hospitalization census from 5,000 to less than 200 days annually across their entire system when they implemented wraparound in their demonstration efforts. Same thing with residential treatment facility population being cut by many-fold reduction in both of these out-of-community placement utilization rates. Controlled study in the Mental Health Services Program for Youth in Massachusetts found lower emergency room expenses, lower inpatient expenses, and the Center for Medicaid Services Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility Waiver Demonstration Project, which spanned multiple states, found that kids that were in the waiver, most of which received a wraparound care coordination process as the primary mechanism to develop plans of care across systems and implement them, that clinical and functional outcomes were at least equal to those children who were in fact placed in institutions, with per capita savings by state ranging from $20,000 to $40,000. So that's a per kid savings in this federal demonstration project. Other states and big counties have demonstrated similarly savings of over $30 million in inpatient psychiatric expenditures. New Jersey, Maine did a really neat study where they showed the reduced net Medicaid spending by 30% after they implemented wraparound Maine. And down Bruce's way in LA County, the Department of Social Services compared kids receiving wraparound to kids who were in institutions and followed them up over time after discharge from each of those, and found that 12-month placement costs after wraparound were nearly 3 times less than for residential treatment center discharged youth. So these are all really good things for systems to think about. We believe that wraparound is a mechanism through which the services and resources that kids with complex needs who would require these kinds of resources or for whom these resources or this attention from systems is mandated, wraparound is a way to ensure that families have the services delivered across these systems be coordinated so that they don't get lost in the systems, become demoralized essentially by the lack of coordination. So it affects family outcomes, kid outcomes, and certainly residential and cost outcomes that can accrue to systems. As such, wraparound is increasingly considered evidence-based. with several inventories now, including it as research or evidence-based at different levels, with others in review currently, including the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices by SAMHSA. So we have good evidence for certain kinds of positive effects, but one thing that is constantly on our mind is what could be improved. Wraparound is not something that was developed by one research team and then implemented consistently across all settings. We're always looking to ask where are the potential innovations that will make it more responsive to a greater range of youth. And one of the things that we've really zeroed in on, both from talking with folks in systems and provider agencies as well as looking at the data, is that we see this effect or this kind of phenomenon where the effect sizes are larger for these residential and cost outcomes, more so than for clinical and functional outcomes. And what we'll see in a second is that oftentimes wraparound-based systems don't necessarily emphasize the nature of the clinical services that must be available to these wraparound teams. And this is problematic because essentially if you do not have an array of effective services available to wraparound care coordinators, wraparound teams, you lose that opportunity for the constituent services and resources that might be built into a kid's plan of care to be that much more effective, that much more capable of responding to that young person's needs, particularly if they're clinical needs. So our question is, can we apply research evidence on effective clinical care within wraparound systems? Can we enhance the quality of options for families and wraparound teams? Can we improve clinical and functional outcomes and further increase efficiency and reduce costs? You know, one of the things that makes us think about this need is that some of the kind of more traditional theories of change for wraparound, they talk about the nature of wraparound and what kinds of outcomes it produces. And model adherent wraparound can be described in a lot of different ways. You can go to the NWI website to see some kind of definitive descriptions. But we're talking about youth and family driving the setting of goals and identification of needs so that it's something that the family feels as though they own and that the plans become more relevant. A single collaboratively designed service plan across all systems. Integration of natural and peer support. Respect for the family's culture and expertise, opportunities for choice, and active evaluation of whether or not the strategies in the plan are actually producing the outcomes that the team is seeking. The idea here is that these short-term outcomes lead to better engagement, more creative plans, better coordination of the actual services that are delivered, better follow-through, things that often don't happen when kids are involved in multiple agencies and no one is responsible for monitoring the success of the plan. So we think that by doing these things, you get more effective services because the services are going to be more likely to work for the family because they were based on the family's identification of needs, the expertise of the team, and that the family be more likely to participate in the services, while also building family assets, greater optimism, improved coping and problem solving. The thing here is that the different aspects of this theory of change have been tested, and a lot of them have been substantiated, but what we recognize, in addition to those pieces of research I showed you before, is that at its fundamental level, there's nothing in this theory of change that necessarily describes a need for the system to have available evidence-based services or treatments that can, in and of themselves, be more likely to meet these needs and achieve these long-term outcomes that wraparound has had some good amount of success in achieving. Stable home-like placements, improved mental health, improved functioning. And so our question again is, if we actively integrate a method for ensuring that the services themselves are evidence-based, can we achieve even better outcomes through wraparound? This is something that is insinuated in the structure that we have at the system level for wraparound, which is that effective wraparound teams really do require organizations that are implementing wraparound, that are supportive, that provide good training, supervision to their staff, and a system that is hospitable to wraparound, with funding mechanisms being amenable to the kind of creative blended funding approaches, flexible funding and so forth. But also one of the features of a hospitable system and a wraparound system of care is, again, the nature of the service array. Again, what are the nature of these services? How can we ensure that they are as effective as possible so that the teamwork that goes on down at this level here with the family is as likely to be as effective as possible? So here are our initial ideas about how to coordinate evidence-based care with wraparound. Can we, in fact, encourage the providers, possibly even the entire child and family team, with the family and youth being, as always, in the primary driver's seat? With all of that in place, can we also make sure that the research base is being consulted when generating strategies to meet the youth and family and teams' identified needs or goals for that family? How could we possibly ensure that what we know works is being consulted when we are designing these plans of care and the strategies that are within them? So that's our first big idea. The second big idea is that we often have clinicians serving actively on wraparound teams, and certainly they're often available within wraparound agencies to the family and youth. In fact, one study that we did with over 100 teams found that clinical services or therapy of some sort, individual or family therapy, was part of the wraparound plan of care in 100% of the plans. Over 100 plans we looked at in multiple states in this study, every single plan had therapy. So the question is, what kind of therapy is being delivered? This is something that the field's been struggling with for decades. And we have some real interesting ideas now that Bruce is about to start talking about how to make sure that the treatments that are available can be both flexible and individualized, as well as based on evidence for effectiveness. So the second big idea is, can we support clinicians in these systems that are working with these wraparound teams and these families to use effective practices that connect to the team and the youth's priority needs? So the third big idea is one of the things in wraparound that we know is that increasingly family and youth peer-to-peer support, as well as paraprofessionally provided services such as mentors, in-home behavioral aids. Third big idea, and this is one of the most interesting, challenging, perhaps difficult ones to pull off as we've been talking with some of our pilot sites, but we have this idea that perhaps it would be possible to ensure that those family and youth peer-to-peer support partners and others who typically serve on wraparound teams are provided with training and support to serve as care extenders or reinforce the use of evidence-based clinical practices that might be delivered by the clinician. Perhaps some of these folks would actually be some of the primary providers of research-based practices. Can we design systems where these folks are supported to better reinforce the provision of some of the research-based services that are available in the system and provided to youth? We'll talk a little bit about that. And so finally, this is something that should happen in all wraparound plans and all wraparound teams and all wraparound-based systems. But we know it happens less frequently than we like. And that is that progress towards meeting family needs, monitoring of the services that are delivered, be consistently that progress and practice be consistently monitored as a standard part of wraparound teamwork, and that plans change when we don't see evidence for progress. This is the fourth big idea about coordinating WRAP with evidence-based practices, if for no other reason that one of the things that we've learned from research is that collaboratively setting goals and monitoring progress may be one of the biggest drivers of positive outcomes in mental health service delivery. So we want to make sure that we do that wherever possible. So what we're going to do now is hand it over to Bruce. But what we're going to, after Bruce talks about the potential for the managing and adapting practice system to provide mechanisms for achieving these big ideas, what we're really doing here is saying, if these are our big ideas, these four things, what Bruce and I have been kind of working with the team on for almost 2 years now is what would be the proposed enhancements or supports to wraparound that might get us to more positive effects with respect to each of these big ideas. So the question is, how to do this? What would be an approach to coordinating evidence-based practice with wraparound to achieve these big ideas? But before we go to Bruce, we're just going to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions about wraparound before we move on to research-based practices.
Thank you, Dr. Bruns. Seeing that we don't have any questions that have come in yet, we're going to move right along to Dr. Chorpita, but I just want to remind participants that they should submit questions as they arise using the question and answer function on their screen. And when we get to that point in the presentation where we can take some questions, we will be happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Bruce. I am. It's 9 o'clock in the morning here. So for those of you who are out here on the West Coast with us, I hope you have some coffee, and I guess those on the East Coast are eating your lunch right now. But think of questions as we go along. We do like questions, and we'll have a couple of more opportunities for folks to type things in. We love to try to come up with answers to those. So what I'm going to talk about now is this thing we call MAP. It's similar. I'm going to copy what Eric said a little bit. It's by saying this is also not a treatment, and I'm going to see if I can explain that in some detail. You heard that at one point I was dealing with the Hawaii system and working there, and MAP really came from a lot of the problem solving we had to do around application of evidence-based practice in that system and where we felt it was possible and where we felt it wasn't. And MAP really became our solution to putting what we know from the evidence base into practice in complex systems. So I'll see if I can lay out for folks what this looks like. And obviously, I'm hoping I'm not perfectly clear because then I wouldn't get any questions. So hopefully you'll ask me some questions too. All right. So as mentioned, this was developed in a statewide system of care. So this is about maybe almost 15 years ago now. We began this problem of trying to figure out how to make an entire state system evidence-based. And you'll see, I'll provide some detail on that about whether that's possible and in what way that's possible. The real goal, our goal back then and still is today, is to address service quality. It was not to disseminate evidence-based practices per se. So sometimes we think about evidence-based practices as a strategy to manage quality, but our view has always been, we've always kept our eye on this quality management aspect of things, and MAP is really about trying to improve the quality of the outcomes for youth and families. It allows for the use of evidence-based practices when possible and when indicated. So that'll become more clear as we go along. Again, MAP is not a treatment. It's a system to support decision-making, and it structures collaboration among youth, family members, service providers, case managers, administrators, and so forth. So it's really a way of trying to get everyone on the same page and say, imagine if we knew everything in the evidence space about what is clinically effective. In the complex world we live in, given the resources that we have, what would we do now? And MAP was really meant to make sure that people are as informed as that at every particular moment when decisions are being made. And we kind of felt like if we could do that, that would address service quality issues. And as you can see already, I hope, you can see how this offers a compatibility with wraparound as Eric has described, that is a little bit easier than perhaps trying to think about how to fit specific evidence-based practices, some of which may proscribe some aspects of wraparound, right? So MAP is really a way to introduce evidence-based knowledge into any kind of service delivery model. So let's get to some of the details here. We know, this is just, maybe this goes without saying, but just in case there's anyone on the planet who still hasn't heard of EBTs, we do know that EBTs could be helpful, that there's about 715 randomized trials right now that we've coded and found that over 400 different evidence-based protocols for children and families exist for a wide variety of problems. And so the question isn't about are evidence-based practices effective or do they demonstrate positive effects in research trials. That's without a doubt true. The issue for maybe the past 10 years really has been how do they fit with systems and the way systems operate. And as many of you experienced with EBTs know, the typical strategy is for evidence-based treatments to bundle practices, settings, measures, and so forth together so that, for example, if you pick an EBT, it's going to say this is the prescribed and proscribed set of practices. So you can do these things, you can't do these other things. It's delivered in this setting, so it's a group treatment, it has to happen at school, and it uses this outcome measure and so forth. And one of the things that we found was that can make things, from the system perspective, suddenly you have a lot of measures and settings and practices to coordinate. And it also leaves little room for context fitting or family choice or dealing with exceptions or difficulties or complexity that come up, right? So you kind of have everything kind of packaged together, and it gets to be difficult to adapt in a structured way. The other thing we found, and I think I'll present some research on that, I think there's a slide coming up on this, is that many youth in our systems, we've done this in California and Hawaii, are simply not eligible for EBTs. So their combination of just some of their basic characteristics, their problem, their age, their gender, their ethnicity, even with the wealth of research that we have, they may not have any participants in any of those research trials who have the same characteristics. And so there technically is no evidence base that speaks directly to that child. And it raises a question, well, what do we do for those kids? In addition, we've had kids who don't respond to EBTs, right? Those of you who are experienced using them know that they tend to work for the majority of kids, but there's some percentage, sometimes 25, sometimes 30%, who need continued supports or continued care. And the question is, well, what will those look like, right? If you have a system that's built of EBTs and you have a certain number of youth who don't respond, you know, the question then is, well, what do we do with those families? We need to have another service. So do we have a second EBT in place, and how many layers to that onion do we need to build into a system so that we know people continue to get support when they need it? And so you can see we're going to move away from an approach of saying, well, there need to be 4, 5, 6 EBTs so that we have sequential options as various things don't work for folks. And we're going to move to a different strategy. So we also think that the typical evidence-based paradigm as it stands has really overemphasized this generalized knowledge base of what's in the literature, which we think is extremely important, but relative to local knowledge. So what's worked in your community, and especially what's working right now for a particular youth. So I could tell long stories about my work with different geographic regions. I'm going to be really vague about this so I don't embarrass anyone, including myself. Where folks have said, we're going to switch over to an evidence-based system, and we're going to take every child in the system and we're going to put them on one evidence-based practice because that's all we can afford. Everybody's going to get CBT next year. And I remember asking, well, what if some of those kids now are already getting better from what they're getting? And do you have a way of knowing that? And the leadership there said, no, we really don't know. And I think that illustrates this idea, right? That local knowledge, you should know if the kids in your system are getting better, and if so, why would you change them to something else, evidence-based or otherwise? So there really needs to be a balance about knowing what's happening on the ground in your system with the youth day to day. Are they getting better? Are they not? And when they're not, that's when we look to the general knowledge base. What does the literature say about options? Where can we get good ideas about what to do next? Okay, so here's the idea. We now publish this. It took us a long time. We've known this for 10 years, but it took us a long time to figure out how to do this study. So what does this slide show? This shows, this gets at the idea, if you took every child in a system, in a mental health system, and this was from the Hawaii intensive needs mental health system, so it's like the top 10% of the kids in the Hawaii public system. If you took every single one of those children and you simulated enrolling them in every single randomized trial for every evidence-based practice, you can actually come up with a list of what evidence-based practices match which kid in a system. And what you see on the left is that what you're able to do through many, many different simulations is to say, if we only had one evidence-based practice, so these are specifically NREP programs. So if you could pick one program off the NREP list, the very best one would ideally serve 34% of the youth in the Hawaii system. And if you could pick the very best set of 2 of the hundreds of evidence-based practices, you could serve 49%. So that's actually pretty good. And but what this tells us is that if you pick carefully, there's a lot of return potentially on the investment in a couple of evidence-based practices in a system. But what you can see, the pattern there is if we pick the very best 3 and the very best 4 and so forth, that there begin to be diminishing returns, that they apply to an increasingly smaller and smaller slice of the pie. And when we get out to 8, we're only able to serve 69% of the kids in the Hawaii system in the ideal world. And this is the shocker. When you get to 100, we're only able to serve 69%. So once you get to 8, there simply are no, there's nothing else we can add. We have 31% of the kids in that system whose features, just problem, age, and gender. We're not even looking at ethnicity or setting or anything else. So a third of the kids in that system don't have an evidence-based practices in the literature at this point. And so from a system design perspective, you can't say then that this is going to be a sufficient solution, that building an array of EBTs is going to answer all of our problems, right? I mean, it even is a little worse than I'm showing you here, because if I back up to this 34%, that, by the way, was multisystemic therapy, we found that even though 34% of the kids in Hawaii matched the characteristics of kids in MST trials, that our actual utilization rate in Hawaii was about 22%. And the reason was not everyone lived next to a region where that service could be offered geographically. They might have been on an island that didn't have enough kids with that particular need to support a therapist there, or they were really rural, geographically remote, and so that service couldn't be coordinated for them. And so even though it looks like if I put 2 in place, I'd have 49%, the actual utilization is somewhat lower than that. And then again, keep in mind that not everyone responded positively to MST or to that second treatment, which was a depression treatment. And so we have to have options for those kids. So you're really talking about, for us, it's 50, 60, 70% of kids in systems are getting some kind of usual care service. And we feel like even with a carefully selected array of 2, 3, 4 EBTs, you're going to have to manage the practice delivered to the other 50% of those kids. And MAP really was about, well, what are we going to do about that? How do we come up with a way to improve the practice that's already happening, given what we know in the evidence base? So that's my rationale for that. And you know, we don't want to throw out the baby. We don't want to say, okay, let's scrap everything about the evidence base. And we saw a lot of that in various systems as people say, see, EBTs don't fit, so they're bad, we can't use them. And we don't think that's true, but we do think that we need to move to more of an a la carte approach. Take the knowledge that we've gotten from 750 or 715 randomized trials and say, you know, even if these specific products don't fit, or if we can't assemble an array that's going to fully satisfy our community, we could pick a few of them that will help, but we can unpack this knowledge. We've learned a lot from 700 trials about what makes kids feel less depressed, about what makes them feel more brave about going to school, about what makes them behave better. And we can use that knowledge in various places. We're making decisions all the time about care. How can we deliver that knowledge to those decision points so that everybody's making informed choices about care? And MAP does that through specific resources, and I'll show some of those in just a minute. So we're really hoping to understand how to take the best ideas from wraparound, the best ideas from what's happening in community care, and put all this together so that we can, again, get to our ultimate outcome, which is not really just to disseminate evidence-based practices, but it's to get kids' lives and families' lives better and to build stronger communities. So that sounds great, but it's all abstract. Let's get down to strategy. If you're going to unpack this knowledge, we have to organize libraries of, you know, what's in the evidence base, right? And the unit of knowledge in the evidence base for many, many years has been the treatment manual. you implement the manual with fidelity or not. And we've tried to code the evidence base to say, well, what practices are commonly used across successful treatments, just over and over and over. And let's build some information resources and supports using that knowledge. So if we know, for example, that practicing something you're afraid of makes you less afraid, we need to be able to deliver that information to folks who are working with anxious youth. And how do we get the best evidence to people at the right time? And you know, as Eric alluded to earlier, as part of structuring wraparound practice as well, how do we make it so that we self-correct over time, right? So if you think of MAP as almost like a kit for building a good evidence-informed treatment plan, even our best guesses informed by the research are not always right, and they don't always work. And so we have to build this in a context that's self-correcting. If things aren't going well, that's that last bullet there, how do we know they're not going well, and what do we do about that? So that's also part of the MAP infrastructure. So I'll just show a couple of the tools here so you can see what this looks like and get a sense of how MAP meets this strategy. So the research, as I mentioned, over 700 randomized trials, over 50,000 youth participants, lots and lots of study groups, you know, over 1,000 treatments have been studied. And we're talking about trying to build an interface for providers making decisions that actually gets them to take the right action, take promising courses of action, right? So expecting folks to read the literature, obviously not helpful. And we realize that that's not the fault of anyone other than the fact that we haven't built a convenient, swift interface, you know, like a Google for what do I do now in mental health, right? So we've now done that. We've been doing this for about 5 years publicly, and maybe about 8 or 10 years with small projects with various systems. So this PracticeWise evidence-based services database is a tool that allows you to say, I have a child with depression, she's 16 years old, and she's African American. Tell me what the literature says on this. And it will do it instantly in a mouse click. So the kinds of results, actually, here's, in this example, you can see your search criteria are disruptive behavior for an 8-year-old. Okay, and it says gender either, so boy or girl was selected, and the strength of evidence is give me the very best support, the very best things. And what you can see is that 24 different studies representing 34 evidence-based practices have come up. So if you have an 8-year-old with disruptive behavior, there are 34 different evidence-based practices, programs out there. Right? So we have that other problem. Sometimes we don't have evidence-based practices that fit a particular youth. Sometimes we have the other problem, which is we have 34. Well, which one is the best one? And we get into those decisions as well, either as purchasers or as practitioners. And what we've done here, what's circled in red, is we read all 34 protocols, and we've coded them for specific strategies they use. We call those practice elements. And that list there says that 92%, you can see under percent of groups, 92% of those 34 protocols had a procedure that taught parents how to praise the youth. So what does that tell you? Well, I don't know which of the 34 I should pick, but I do know that praise seems to be a very, very common part of successful practices for disruptive behavior. The best evidence-based practices for disruptive behavior include praise, include rewards, include timeout programs very commonly for 8-year-olds. Right? They're all above 85%. And there's a whole bunch of other ones. Now, this brings us to other questions, and as I've trained on this stuff in other states, people say, this is great, but I don't know what differential reinforcement of other behavior is, or I don't know what commands is. Do I just shout commands at a family? What does that actually mean? So we're going to get to that. Right? It's not sufficient to say, here's what works. We have to tell people how to do it. So that's coming. But really, this is about, you know, just to stick on this one point for a minute. We're trying to if we're going to unpack the knowledge of what's in the evidence base, we're thinking about looking across the protocols. So here's 3 you may be familiar with. These are evidence-based protocols for disruptive behavior. We have some of these in place in California: Incredible Years, PCIT, and Defiant Children. They're all considered parent training programs. That's the common name for them in the literature. There's many, many different kinds of evidence-based parent training programs. These are just 3 examples. And what we found through our coding is that, and sorry, one of those arrows is a bit cut off there, but is that if you look within those protocols, you're going to see that they have certain ingredients in common. So this is just showing what I showed again on the previous slide, which is we want to see, look, 2 of the 3 use a timeout program. So, you know, maybe that's helpful to know that timeout's a common ingredient of effective parent training programs. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you get to these things, and I've had practitioners come up to me at the break at some of these presentations we do, and they say, this is great, but we don't know how to do any of these things. Don't tell my supervisor, but I've never heard of differential reinforcement, or I've never been in a timeout. I've been in a timeout, but I've never actually taught a family how to do one. I was in one when I was little. So we want to help people with that as well, and so we have to get down to specific resources. So the story behind this, if you look on the, I think there are labels for these. We have process guides, which are about, I'm going to talk a bit about those in a second, how to put things together. But let's look at the right side here, these practice guides. So if I said motivational enhancement was a part of 90% of successful treatments for a particular problem like substance use, you might say, that's great. Now, how do I do motivational enhancement? Well, we have a guide that tells you what are the core steps. I'll show you what that looks like. But the story behind these guides is a lot of this setting up these detailed resources began with some work we did in Minnesota. And before we had these guides developed, I asked a large number of practitioners, so if we develop these guides that describe how to do these procedures, how should we make them look? You know, what would you like to see, because we want you to use them? And everyone in Minnesota said, just make sure they're only 1 page. So we thought, oh my gosh, that's kind of a tricky thing to do, but we did make them 1 page. We do write on the back of them, so we're cheating, and it's actually 2 pages, but we're able to kind of satisfy that request. And we do say 1 page, please print on 2 sides. So the practice guides are all 2 sides of 1 page, and it really forced us to say, what are the real core nuts and bolts of all of these procedures in all 700 of these studies? They look pretty simple. So practitioners like the common look and feel, right? There's a label that tells you what it is, it tells you when to use it, and who it's for. And there's also this kind of semi-formal interface here. There's a checklist of the steps, like if you're doing, this is problem solving, that you start off by normalizing problems. Everybody has problems, you know. And then you teach the 5 steps, and then you practice using the problem solving steps with a specific problem. And we find that more experienced users only read the left side of this page, and the beginner users read the right side of this page that outline what are the details for each of these steps. And the most experienced users might not even look at the steps anymore, right? You get to a point where you fade. As your expertise deepens, you may rely on this particular resource a little bit less. And so we've tried to build this interface so that people can interact with the knowledge base as a beginner, but also as a seasoned expert who's great with problem solving or motivational interviewing. Okay, so these are the ingredients, right? These practices are the ingredients, and we need more than ingredients, right? We can't just take the practices, and people used to criticize and say, you can't just take all these practices, throw them together, and have a high-functioning evidence-based system. And we agree. You can't. I couldn't take what's on the counter here, throw them in a bowl, and say we're having brownies, right? There's a way to put them together. There's an order and there's a logic. And basically, I'm just going to show you a couple of quick examples here. There's an order and logic and a recipe, there's an organized way to put these things together. I'm just going to show you a few quick kind of meta recipes that we get from looking at all these trials. So one thing we found that most evidence-based practices have in common is that they have a strong therapeutic focus, and if they have to manage some kind of interference or complexity, they try to deal with that quickly and get back on focus. And that within that focus, there tends to be a connect phase of getting to know a child, educating the family about things, a cultivate phase of teaching and rehearsing practices, and then a consolidate phase of review and practicing in new situations. So this is an example from depression, right? You engage and do psychoeducation, you work on particular skills, and then you consolidate at the end. And there might be some various practices on deck if things go wrong that are down in that lower box. And so we worked with folks to do the searches on the literature using that tool that I showed you, and then you organize it into a treatment plan in this manner. Here's another recipe. How do you make a session plan, right? How do you go from a practice guide that's a 1-page guide to an actual set of steps. So this is kind of a recipe for how to make a session out of a practitioner guide. There's another recipe for what do we do when there are issues with diversity, whether they're cultural issues, poverty issues, that might force us to have to think about how to adapt what we're doing. And there's sort of, so we go, with MAP, we go over 6 ways of thinking about structured adaptation to accommodate diversity. Anyhow, this is just, I'm just showing you kind of the tip of the iceberg of what this system is like, and I just want to illustrate it's really a system for informed action and guiding thinking, as opposed to it's a particular treatment that has a specific strict model to follow. And people often ask, well, does this work? This seems like a lot of complexity. In some ways, you're building things from scratch. How are you going to know it's worked if it's never really been tested? Now, we do have some data showing it works very well, actually, so it's not fair to say it hasn't been tested. But as I say about any evidence-based practice, that whether it's been tested many times in trials or not, not everything is guaranteed to work. And so we need to have a tool to know if it's not working in real time so we can adjust, right? So MAP is used in conjunction with this tool we call the clinical dashboard. And it's basically a communication tool. It allows us all to get on the same page about what's happening and what have we done. So on the top, you'll see there are progress ratings. Here are depression ratings going down. That's very good. This is a 7-year-old girl, African-American girl, Maggie again. She's back. She's doing better. And you can see on the bottom, the practices that were delivered are some of the practices. If you did a search for depression, the evidence-based practices, the practice elements returned would include those that you see here: problem solving, activity selection, relaxation. All of those are effective components of evidence-based practices for depression. Right, so here's examples of other things you can find out from dashboards. We find that if there's an engagement problem, right, you can see that there's no contact for 3 months, that skills aren't being delivered, or another 6-week gap. So this is basically a way for us to know what's happening when, and we can adapt and go back and get new ideas in real time. And I'm going to tie this back to wraparound in a minute, but I hope you can see how these particular strategies can really fit into almost any context. MAP doesn't say you have to have this particular setting. Does it have to be group? Does it have to be individual, home-based, once a week, 5 days a week? All of that depends on what the needs of the youth and family are. And MAP is really about introducing these evidence-based procedures and this communication tool of the dashboard into any context. Now, how did that work in the Hawaii system of care? I'm just wrapping up here now with the couple of slides on what's the evidence for MAP. And we implemented this in conjunction with one evidence-based practice in the Hawaii system of care over a 3-year period. And basically what this shows is that in the first quarter of the fiscal year 2002, kids were getting better 1.1 unit per month. So that's the rate of improvement on the CAFAS, which is a functioning measure. And as we continued to train the entire statewide workforce in these practice elements and in the MAP system, set up dashboards and so forth, and again, about 22% of the kids were getting multisystemic therapy. Over a 3-year period, we found that the overall rate of improvement more than doubled for all kids, across all kids in the system. So that final effect size, kids were getting better, almost 1 full standard deviation per year on the CAFAS. Which is a pretty nice effect size. And again, coming at it from the side of not just introducing EBTs, but how are we going to turbocharge usual care and make usual care really effective, which is 70% of the business in Hawaii and in most states. And when we did that, we found that everybody started getting better much, much faster. In LA County, we have about MAP is delivered to about 22% of kids. That was last year. That's rising to about 40%. So MAP is, again, in this context, filling that void of, if you don't meet all these other slices of this pie, are evidence-based practices in LA County. So we have 33 or 34 at last count implemented in the county. Very complex. As you can see from some very narrow slices, some EBTs are trained and rolled out, and then they're delivered to 12 out of 100,000 kids. So they're low impact, right? So we haven't been that strategic with our selection here. And what's happening, as we expect to happen in most places, is there will be kids who aren't really a match for any of those. They're getting MAP now. And those MAP outcomes in LA County, here's our outcomes for 1,000 or 1,100 kids in LA County in 2012, are showing that on the Youth Outcome Questionnaire, their effect sizes are 0.76, and that's as good or better than any of the other EBTs in our county. So MAP as a system for building treatments for kids or for contexts that don't allow other evidence-based practices appears to be having a nice effect as expected in our county here too. So now I'm going to pause and see if there are questions about MAP. I see I have one question that came up on the chat board, and there may be others that come up. So click the Q&A icon that's located in the hidden toolbar. It's hidden, but if you click on that green thing, I think you will get that Q&A icon, and you can ask questions as well. So I'm going to answer, if it's okay with our team, I'm going to answer that first question. I'm going to try to answer that first question, which is, here it is. It is, what about fidelity? And it's Christopher Bluntey, a buddy of mine who I saw just earlier this year. How do you know this approach works if not adhering to a manual? I like this. I'm going to answer the second part of that question is you don't. You don't know if anything works, right? So what I tried to very quickly spell out is there's no guarantee that anything works, and that's why we have a clinical dashboard. That's why we have a system that is always looking at the local evidence, right? So the question itself raises this set of assumptions, which is if we do the treatment right, then there's a guarantee we'll get the right outcome. And we like to turn that around and say, you know, we're really not as concerned about getting the treatment right as we are about getting the outcome. That's, at the end of the day, what matters. And if we're not, we go back to the evidence base and say, what are we doing that's wrong? Or what ideas have we overlooked in the evidence base that we could probably use to try to improve this particular plan? And so it's really not this, it's not a paradigm where you say there's a scripted way to do this, and if we follow that script, we're probably going to be successful. It's more about, let's assume that there's never a guarantee. Let's take the very best ideas we can get from the literature, try to get them to look as close as possible to a high fidelity EBT. If it's working, great. If it's not, we make intelligent, structured, informed adaptation using a variety of tools and resources. And we keep on tinkering and plugging away until we get where we want to get. You know, so that's kind of the philosophy. And I don't want to make it sound like there's no fidelity. I mean, in many jurisdictions where we train MAP, there is a, you know, there's a set of training standards. Folks have to know how to do these specific practices. They have to know how to coordinate them and organize them into a thoughtful, intelligent plan. But there is not one manual that says, you know, there is one front-to-back script that is going to fit every youth. And because we can't have MAP work that way, that's the point. We have to have sort of fidelity to the various components. Do you know how to do a web search and find practices that fit a child? Do you know how to do those practices? Do you know how to detect whether they're working or not using a clinical dashboard? So those are the kinds of skills we try to make sure that providers have.
So, Bruce, we actually have another question that came in. It's with regard to your matching youth to studies chart. And the question was, does the matching youth to studies chart mean that if you choose any one EBT, for example, you can serve approximately 34% of kids based on their characteristics, or is it that there is one particular EBT that would match 34%?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And so I simplified, again, that was about 8 years of work to do that one chart. And what's behind that is, the answer is that one was, we looked at 420 or so evidence-based practices, and we ran that simulation over and over and over again until we found which one practice matched the very largest number of kids, and that was multisystemic therapy in that system given those kids. So this is a local, you know, there is no one answer. You know, that service array building is an exercise that has to be done in each geographic location. So in Los Angeles County, for example, MST would not fit 34% of the youth here. It might fit about 8%, right? So we have a very different system. And the number one practice in LA County That's a good question, actually. I think it would probably be something like incredible years, would be my guess, for the prevention and early intervention. But I haven't done that analysis. So the way we do that is we run that. If there's 400 evidence-based practices, we run that analysis 400 times, and it gets more complicated because when you're trying to come up with the best set of 2, there are, I don't know, 1,000 sets of 2 chosen from 400, and then the best set of 3, and there's like 10,000 possible sets of 3 chosen from 400. And when you get up to 8, there's actually millions of possible sets of treatments, of 8 treatments chosen from 400. So we actually run this. It takes several days on a computer to figure out what the best 8 is. But we can do that for any system and say, if you were to buy 8 evidence-based practices, or 6 or 5, which would be the best ones, and how many would they cover, and who would be not covered by those? We can do those analyses. They just take a fair amount of computer time to do it because there's lots and lots of simulations that go on. So the short answer is, no, you can't just pick any EBT and have it cover 34%. That was in a specific system, and it referred to a specific practice, and that wouldn't replicate in other systems.
Okay, great. And one more question, and then we'll keep it moving. So we received a question asking if you have had any discussions with universities about integrating MAP into the curricula of the various mental health disciplines, such as psychology and social work.
Great question. So we're working.
That was asked by Rick Barth, I think.
Was that right?
I don't know. Just
it sounds like it. That's a Rick Barth question. So we've been working for almost 5 years with Rick Barth, who is, if you don't know Rick, he's Dean of Social Work at University of Maryland. And what we've been doing, and we're actually getting really far along on this now, is working on a plan to, for the first few years, we were working with social work faculty, inviting them to UCLA from around the country every summer to learn MAP so they could go back to their universities and teach MAP in their clinical practica. And we're doing that in psychology through the Delaware Project, which you may hear more about. If you don't know about the Delaware Project, you can search delawareproject.org. But that's about to roll out as a clinical science psychology initiative. So it's really about how do you teach practitioners how to build a treatment from the evidence base as opposed to simply selecting and using an evidence-based treatment. And yes, there's a substantial amount of work going on our side to be able to build that into curricula for various academic programs. And we're probably a year away from having a model where academic faculty can actually partially certify folks in MAP, and in conjunction with agency supervisors working at field placement sites, that social work graduates should be able to graduate with a MAP certificate if they wanted to have one of those, suitable for framing, putting on your refrigerator, or if you're in LA County, it actually allows you to get paid. So we're definitely going down that road, and what you'll see coming on the horizon is a lot of distance learning stuff too. So folks who want to learn parts of MAP over the internet and take the tests and do CE credits and things like that, that is also coming.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. I think we're going to keep moving along in the essence of time because I know I'm sure folks want to hear about RAP and MAP and how they can be integrated.
Right. So here's how they go together, and Eric and I may be jumping back and forth here a little bit here. I have to give Eric credit for this picture. This is a RAP MAP. How do you find a RAP MAP picture?
This is the success. This is the evidence of our success right here.
That's right. This is probably this is as far along as we've gotten, by the way, with RAP MAP. Is just this picture. But
no, don't say that. So you might want to hand it back to me real quick and just kind of like I can walk. So one thing is that we've left this only with 10 minutes or so perhaps, so we leave time for questions to talk about how to combine RAP and MAP. But I think that's okay because what Bruce primarily, as well as myself and Kamala and Sheila have already talked about is that this is about building system strategies, not building something that has a cool, logo like this. And so wraparound is a system strategy. Mapping the relevance of different manualized EBPs to your system population, as Bruce was just describing, was done in Hawaii as a system strategy. MAP is a system strategy for supporting clinicians and providers in the system. and even, tracking outcomes at a system level like they did in Hawaii and kind of demanding that folks use dashboards for individual level kids. These are all system strategies, and so that's the most important thing. Another system strategy, we think, is the idea that you will thoughtfully coordinate for the kids with the most complex needs who are getting wraparound care coordination, evidence-based practices into that process, and so thus blending or coordinating RAP and MAP. So we talked about those 4 big ideas about doing that piece of system strategizing. And so in working with a few different provider agencies and states, again, Maryland is a real early adopter of this idea, we've kind of worked with family partners, care coordinators, supervisors, administrators to say, well, how do you do the idea, this first idea of generating research-based options in plan building in wraparound in a way that doesn't corrode at the principle of family and youth voice and choice, family and youth driven, team-based, and so forth? How do we do this in a way that keeps, clinical care from taking over what is really supposed to be a process of meeting needs of families? And so one thing that we are working on in terms of building curricula as well as trying it out in practice is can we use those PWEBs, or those practice-wise evidence-based service strategies, at strategic points in the planning process? And so examples would be when the youth has a need that could be met through clinical services. And again, when you see studies showing 100% of wraparound plans have clinical care as a component, we know that there's a lot of demand for clinical service in wraparound plans. So can we ensure that the clinical strategies that are used by those practitioners are in fact based on well connected to the needs? Another kind of approach might be to do it when teams are stuck and looking for options. Well, let's run one of those PWEB searches and see what comes up, and then everyone can kind of strategize around it, think about creative ways to do it, so it's not necessarily done in some sort of robot-like fashion, but something that is actually a basis for team brainstorming and creative problem solving. Another way to potentially blend research-based options into wraparound principle adherent planning would be to use those practice guides to help families and team members understand some of the options that are being generated, so it's not something that's kind of secret. Oftentimes, I'll just be really frank, I go into wraparound team meetings and observe, or as a participant, and the clinician sitting in the corner just saying, yeah, we've been working together for about 8 months, everything's really good, he's been showing up, and we've been having a good time. You have no idea necessarily what kind of strategies are being used in the clinical context. Or it could be that these practice guides help folks think about interesting ways in which natural supports and community supports might be used to help meet needs. So those practice guides could also be a very valuable resource to increase transparency and clarity of the purpose of clinical services, or deepen the planning process to help facilitate brainstorming. So those of you who know wraparound well will kind of get that need to try and blend the use of these practices into a wraparound context. Bruce, you have anything to add to that example?
No, I mean I think your example's spot on. And I like the point you're making about the transparency of the practice guides. Is a really good one. I mean, what we're trying to do is create a level playing field, make sure everybody's informed, and that there's not sort of this asymmetry or, one party knows more than the other. We're trying to get the evidence base in everybody's hands, basically.
So the second big idea is probably one of the more straightforward ones of these, which is because we know that clinicians are often called upon to help provide support to plan of care and are members of wraparound teams, if we train and coach the clinicians who are affiliated with these wraparound initiatives on using the MAP system, certify them in MAP, or provide them just with access to the resources, our hope is that they will unto themselves become more capable of using the evidence base. And our thought is that at a fundamental level, even without all of the co-training of these multiple roles, care coordinators, family partners, clinicians, that we think we're going to do in some of our pilot sites coming up now, even just having clinicians that are affiliated with wraparound teams and serving on wraparound teams, trained and coached to use the MAP system, we do think that that would provide a likely bump up in effects, because we've seen from other randomized studies that modular approaches to providing therapy are both are embraced by clinicians and also get more positive clinical and functional outcomes. So this is kind of a straightforward idea, which is to just simply enhance the skills of clinicians in wraparound contexts and systems of care by exposing them to the MAP system and potentially getting them certified on how to use those tools.
Yeah, and Eric, let me add to that, because you alluded to the child steps trial. I mean, and it gets back to Chris's question about what about fidelity.
How do we know it works?
We did configure MAP for a specific randomized trial, and did recently published a randomized trial where it not only beat usual care, but it beat standard EBTs in a trial. So, we do believe that this way of coordinating things and kind of customizing from elements way of doing treatment shows real promise. Okay, and this is, I just put one slide in on this, but this is what I said before is there are going to be a lot of decisions made about care, and what we did here was we took the diamonds in the middle represent the common sequence of decision for kids in wraparound, and what you see on the right is various actions that you would take, and on the left are the resources that inform those decisions. So if you're going to try to ask, is the vision or plan on focus, you're going to have information gathered from an assessment, you'll have a plan of care, you have those process guides that I showed you and the PWebs database to give you ideas. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but it also gets at that fidelity question of, is there more, is this really kind of loosey-goosey, or how organized is this? And, this is to illustrate, we really have thought through what are the key decisions that are made in providing care in a wraparound context and in many other contexts. And if those are underinformed, can we provide a convenient, specific visual resource for somebody to say, oh, now I know whether this is happening or not, and I know what to do about it. So there is a structured logic model behind this MAP plus WRAP that we're talking about.
Right. So this would apply potentially to the use of MAP within a WRAP team, but also it illustrates, again, that, our feeling is that clinicians equipped with this kind of orientation to doing this work, this is very much in line with the way we hope and try to train wraparound teams to work, which is to have a sequence of events that talk about identifying needs, putting together strategies, and always using this approach to looking at a dashboard of progress to know whether or not you need to revise the plan and think of new strategies. If we have clinicians also kind of oriented, both clinicians and facilitators oriented to that same kind of approach, but with tools that are relevant to their specific role in providing care, then our thought is that we will be all the more effective. So we want to save a few minutes for questions. So the other two ideas, the first one is that parent partners and community supports could serve as evidence-based practice care extenders. And again, this is something that will require some real adaptation to the local context, because every wraparound initiative or system of care has different kinds of roles that they're resourcing to do work with the youth with the most complex needs. But very frequently it's peer support, other paraprofessional roles, and our idea is that down the line, and we're already kind of doing some work with this with Adam Bernstein of PracticeWise, to take certain MAP treatment elements and ask whether they're commonly used by these kids and adapt them into strategies that would be appropriate for peer support and paraprofessionals to serve as care extenders. So examples would be, and this is from a survey we did of some parent partners and their supervisors, commands or effective instructions. I mean, if parent partners, and paraprofessionals who are working in the home, working with families, 4, 5, 8 hours a week rather than just 1 or 2 like most clinicians, are able to help follow on with some of the things that parents are learning about how to praise or attend or or do effective instructions or commands, to do active ignoring, to have star charts and others in the house, actively helping support the way to do timeout, perhaps with those practice guides also in play. We may get better effects of those strategies when they're in wraparound plans. And so that's an exciting idea that really gets the peer support folks excited to think that they would get helped, trained and supported to do that kind of work, because sometimes they feel as though their role in wraparound teams is a little nebulous, and to have those skills with, there's a lot of boundaries we have to deal with in terms of roles and training. But we have hope that this is something that potentially could be done in some of our pilot sites. And then the final thing is, again, this is a no-brainer in terms of both achieving maximum effects of therapy or clinical work as well as wraparound. We need to monitor more consistently and change plans as needed. And MAP provides this template in the form of the dashboard that could be used at a team level, could be used by the clinician in their individual work. But the main thing is that it's done. It doesn't have to take the format of this, which is fairly complex. This is a MAP dashboard that's been formatted more to be kind of reviewing the types of the phases of wraparound and the activities of wraparound that have gone on, as well as the clinical interventions that have occurred, mapped against progress in certain things like it looks like we've got a couple of CANS subscales up here that are relevant to the family, and so forth. So again, we try to teach this in all of our wraparound trainings, but it often doesn't happen, and we need to make sure that it does. So just to conclude and make sure there's time for questions, we have these big ideas. We have proposed enhancements that we think would be achieved by bringing wraparound and MAP together. So using the MAP tools to generate strategies, ensure clinicians are trained on MAP, helping parents, parent partners and others provide care extension. And again, there's mechanisms for achieving these potentially that we are now working on developing curricula and follow-on support work in a few places that we've already discussed. So using the PWebs at strategic points, training the clinicians and so forth. And what our hope is that the kinds of effects we're going to get that often already happen in wraparound will be all the more enhanced. So greater ranges of options for families and teams, options based on evidence for effectiveness, families and teams better engaged, more hopeful because they see these options even when they're stuck. These are things that, sometimes don't always happen, and we would like to think that we can enhance it, like Bruce was saying before. It's not as though evidence-based treatments achieve they may be evidence-based in that they are better than services as usual in some research trials, but when you see that systems say, yeah, well, we've implemented MST and we got our recidivism down from 50% to 38%, that's a huge victory. It's like, well, that's great. So now how do we get it down to 30%? How do we get it down to 20%? It's the same thing. How do we enhance the best ideas we already have? So there are all these effects that we would like to think will be achieved by bringing together in a coordinated fashion the evidence-based practices with wraparound in this way. And all we'll really say about why might this work is that we have seen these pieces of evidence at a state level as well as in places like LA County and the randomized trial, the Child Steps trial that Bruce was referring to, that showed better progress than standard evidence-based treatments in a randomized trial. We are beginning to do this, and we're getting really good initial response. The problem is that figuring out how to flexibly install it in complex systems is something we have to work out with each individual place. There's not going to be this kind of one-size-fits-all way to do wraparound and MAP, because MAP is used flexibly and wraparound is applied flexibly in systems. So we're working with several places, and we're probably going to learn different lessons from each about how you might do this in coordinated fashion. But what we have seen in some initial data is that facilitators, for instance, rate the usefulness of the MAP tools almost as useful as therapists. And so that's one example of evidence we're getting already that this is something that could be effective. So what kind of questions do we have out there now that we have 4 minutes left?
So we have, we received one quick question. How long on average does it take a given clinician to become adept at using MAP in his or her daily practice?
That's a good question. We have, our typical training is about a 6-month process, and so, you know, adept is it could be interpreted in many ways, but we feel like that's enough for folks to get started. And MAP, like anything else, or maybe not like anything else, we don't see it as like you jump over a certain bar and then for the rest of your life you're going to be great and you can do it. It's more like, how do you get your feet wet with the literature and the evidence base and really understand how to use MAP as a way to stay on top of the literature as the literature evolves. And so there is this expectation that although you may reach a minimum kind of standard by 6 months, that you engage in continuing to look at new practices, and as you do searches, the literature is going to be evolving. And so it's kind of a lifelong thing in a way, but that first step for most folks is about a 6-month process. And here's the follow-up information. If you have questions or things, the PracticeWise website has stuff about MAP. There's a support email there. There's the Wraparound website as well, and you could email either Eric or me with questions as well in terms of if there's any follow-up questions we didn't get to.
And we really are interested in systems, states, other provider agencies that are interested, who may be already doing one or the other of these, or maybe neither, who would be interested in exploring how to do them in coordinated fashion, add one or the other, or even both. And so we encourage folks to let us know if there's interest out there. We do have a few places, but we are really in a stage right now of learning the logistics of how we might do this. Again, taking it from a kind of orientation that what we're really interested in is just finding ways to improve systems by bringing some of the best options that we have for kids together in systems.
Great, thank you. We're just going to turn this back over to Kamala.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, both Bruce and Eric. That was very, very interesting, and it's not the first time I've heard it, and it's still very compelling. So I just wanted to wrap up by saying, what we hope that we presented to you today is yet another look at tools for the toolbox. Children are unique, their needs change over time, so we hope that what you've heard today is a catalyst for additional thought about the tools in your toolbox and what in your state is available for children, youth, and families. And so go back to the tables that you sit at and think about whether it's wraparound, whether it's PracticeWise and MAP. This is a catalyst for further discussion, and so please take an opportunity to think further about it. Give us feedback, whether it's through the evaluation or other direct means, and we look forward to having you join us on the next call. And I'm going to turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Kamala. This is just a reminder that the slides and a video archive will be available on our website shortly. An email announcing the posting of these materials will be sent to today's participants as well. Our next webinar in this series will take place during the month of November and will focus on trauma-informed screening, assessment, and treatment for children and youth in foster care, and more details will be made available in October. We ask that you kindly complete a very brief online evaluation, which will pop up on your screen after this event is finished. Your feedback is very important to us. And finally, we would like to once again thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation and SAMHSA under cooperative agreement with the Administration for Children and Families for the support of this webinar series. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.